Can you explain a little bit about yourself, Jeff? I'll let you explain better than I can.
Yeah, so a little bit of personal history. Erik and I went to high school together. Then we were at UNR together for my bachelor's. I did my master's there as well. I moved on to UC Davis to do a PhD in high performance and parallel computing and also GPU computing. And then I got hired at Google straight out of my PhD program. I'd done a couple internships there and at other places as well. I started in the Zurich office in Switzerland, and I've been here for 5.5 years.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I mean, full disclosure, Jeff actually helped tutor me when I was in college, definitely for some of those CS 202 classes, I think 302 and maybe 202, some algorithms. I was like, how do I do this? And he was gracious enough to help me and very helpful. And obviously you have moved on and gone to work at Google, which is awesome, which reason I wanted to talk to you and just to catch up, though it's been a long time. I know you're pretty busy in Zurich with Google, is just to ask you some questions how it is to work at Google, from which you can talk about, and also a little bit about some of the topics that a lot of people are interested in about getting into programming in general.
Okay.
So let's just jump on. Let's just start there. Like, so how you've been with Google for 8 years? Is that
No,
right?
no, no, 5.5. I graduated from UC Davis in June 2012, and I started actually on my 30th birthday, October 1st, 2012. So it'll be 6 years in October.
That's awesome. That's long. And what is it like in the day of a life of a Googler?
I would imagine if anybody else has held a tech job, it's going to be pretty similar. My day is a little different because I'm not quite the normal person, but most people get in. They, depending on how high up in the food chain you are, you have more or less meetings throughout the day. I have managed to avoid taking on that sort of responsibility, so I get maybe half an hour to an hour a day where I have meetings, and the rest of the time I'm either programming, looking after jobs, running some sort of analysis, or doing kind of anything else you might expect from a tech job.
So, I mean, the movies make it out to be a little differently. I mean, is it a different experience when you're new to Google? I guess they call them nooglers.
Yep, I call them nooglers.
And so, how is that different when you first start off?
Honestly, so I was an intern twice, and actually I remember kind of the feeling that I had there and talking with friends who had never worked before and just started out at Google. I think that, like most jobs, you kind of have this honeymoon period where absolutely everything is awesome. And I think after some time, reality sets in and you realize it's a job. They're paying you to do something. I happen to love what I'm doing, so I like it. But I think the only difference between when you first start and later on is just somebody might phrase it as how jaded you are. I would just say it's like what sort of lens you can look at your work through. I feel like I can look at it through more realistic lens now than when I first started.
That's funny. Yeah, I definitely when I started my first job right out of college, I was like, "This is amazing! I get to do programming every day. I'm working on all these interesting problems." And then like a year later, I'm like, "This is okay. I mean, this is fun, but definitely the honeymoon period is ended, and then I have to really focus on what I want to do long term and stuff like that." Now, in the tech industry, I know it's really important, and this is kind of a debate. And I want to get back to ask you some more questions about Google, but there's you obviously have a PhD and you have a lot of experience in tech and a lot of experience developing and programming in an academic setting and also in these different jobs you've worked at. Uh, there's a lot of people in my audience that don't have a degree at all. And there's a lot of people that are looking at going to boot camps, and there's a lot of people that are just trying to teach themselves how to program or how to get a development job. I mean, what do you think about that? What is your thoughts on this idea of what's the best path for people, and compared to going to something, getting a job like a place like Google, what would you recommend?
Okay, so there's two questions there. The first was, what do I think of people who are going kind of like self-taught or boot camp way? And the second one is what I would recommend if you wanted to get a job at Google. For the first question, I think everybody knows the answer. It's highly individualized. There are some people who have absolutely no problem teaching themselves or picking stuff up quickly if you happen to be a natural at programming. There's in my opinion, there's no need to put yourself through 4 years of a bachelor's degree if you can get all the skills you need to be successful through a boot camp and then maybe working your way up, starting in like some kind of IT support role and eventually working your way into a software engineering position. I think that there's nothing wrong with that. For me, I did 2 internships at Google, one after my second year as a PhD and one after my third year as a PhD. After my third year, I had an offer. Actually, after my second year and after my third year, I had offers to work full-time at Google. I turned them down because I figured, I started this PhD thing, I'm going to finish it. In reality, I didn't have to. Personally, it was good for me. I had an amazing time doing my PhD. If I had left early, I would not be with my wife right now. So I'm not going to say, oh, I wish I had done that. But it's not necessary. There are people who come straight out of bachelor's. There are other people who did something in college that was not even related at all to computer science or engineering and then managed to get hired at Google. And there are still people who finished high school or some kind of technical school, depending on the country that you're from and the high school system that they had. And maybe they started out at another job and were able to get hired in sideways. Now, if you ask, what do I think you should do if you're coming to work for Google? The path of least resistance is getting a bachelor's degree. That is basically our minimum requirements to getting hired. If you're an exceptional person and you've done a lot of open source work by the time you're through with high school, there's a slight chance you're going to get in, but it's still very, very difficult. You have to be the superstar in your field, or like have some kind of open source thing that basically everybody knows about in order to even get an interview at Google without having a bachelor's degree. The other way that you can get in is work experience. If you finished high school and you started working, as I said, you're probably not going to get a software engineering position straight out of high school, but it's not unheard of to, for example, work IT support or something like that. You start writing scripts or you start actually engineering for the office that you work at. You work your way up and maybe you transition into an engineering role. That's also, it's not as common because by far the majority of people that work at Google have bachelor's degrees or higher. But it still happens. There are definitely people who don't have a college degree that work for Google as an engineer.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. So you're saying there is some possibilities if you have a lot of work experience. So, or you have a special, like you're really into open source, you have a reputation perhaps in the industry. Let me ask you this: if you are one of those people that let me say, if you have a lot of experience, then that can help get you the interview as well. And you don't necessarily have to have the degree. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. If you work for 2-3 years as an engineer at another firm, that's essentially the same thing as having a bachelor's degree.
Right. And so, but with that said, you may have a lot of practical experience, but you're still going to have the same sort of interview that everyone else has, correct? So you're probably going to get the same algorithm type questions. You're still going to have the multiple interviews with different stakeholders in the company.
You'll have 2 different phone screens and you'll have 4 to 6 in-person interviews. All of them will be technical if you're interviewing for an engineering position. Yeah, it's definitely going to happen. And for example, we both took analysis of algorithms at UNR. That class, everybody says, oh, this is so boring. Like it's all theoretical. You never use it. You use it all the time. Anybody who's actually been in a real engineering role, but where they're not just copying and pasting code, but they're actually writing stuff from scratch. And especially if you've done something where performance matters, you have to know all that stuff. And you can easily pick up that book. Well, that book is a little dense. You might not easily pick that one up, but if you have it over there, you can show it later. Yeah, but you can.
I have it in my bookshelf.
Yeah, you can easily learn a lot of this stuff on your own. You don't have to go to university to learn it, but it's required knowledge. If you don't know a lot of the stuff, like if somebody asks you, okay, can you tell me how find in a binary search tree works? If you can't answer that question, it shows that you're lacking some basic knowledge from computer science. Or if you can't tell somebody why quicksort the naive quicksort is a bad idea for general data, it's also showing that you're lacking some basic knowledge. And those are easy gaps to fill, but you still need to fill them nonetheless.
Do you have recommendations other than our old school algorithms to third edition book?
I think it
Where to learn?
depends. Yeah, I think it depends on what your passion is. If you're really into kind of reading and self-study, I think that book is actually fantastic. I do know that there's at least one book and probably a plethora of websites out there about cracking the coding interview. I would go through those. Something that I found very helpful was actually that the University of Valladolid in Spain has the online programming contest site. Go through and solve literally hundreds of those. If you can get through that, my guess is you'll do fine.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, I had gone on some interviews a while back. I know I'm pretty happy with my job now, but I had a few interviews a while back, and I went and I took cracking the coding interview. I read a bunch of those chapters. I went to code fights. I went to Leak Code, and then there was even like a Facebook group I joined, and it helped me. And then I also used Pramp.com as another resource. I didn't, full disclosure, I actually interviewed with Google one time and I did not get the job, but it did. I think it did help me somewhat.
I should also give you a full disclosure. We have, so I do interview for Google, and I know many people who are on hiring committees. They basically aggregate all the interview feedback and come up with a yes or no decision. It's not even a secret. We say all the time, we would much rather have false negatives than false positives. So the fact that you didn't get hired doesn't mean you couldn't do the job there. It just means that you didn't make it through the interview process.
Yep. Yeah. I figure that it's a learning experience, and hopefully I was one of those false positives.
Yeah. False negatives.
False. I just told myself, yes, it'd be a false negative.
Yeah, there you go. False positive means you would have gotten in even though you shouldn't have.
Got it. That's what I meant. Perfect. So, yeah, I mean, definitely, I remember my experience was a couple of phone interviews, and then they flew me down to Mountain View, and they gave me a choice if I wanted to go to Mountain View or San Francisco or Seattle. And I think I chose Mountain View because it was closest by. And then when I got there, and this was a while ago, by the way, and then when I got there, they put me up in a hotel, and I remember they gave me, in my hotel room, they gave me like a sheet that said, hey, if you have time, congratulations for getting interviewed at Google, and if you have time, here's some sightseeing you could do. And I was thinking, like, I'm pretty nervous. I don't have time to go and see the, all the views of Mountain View for the 1 day or 2 days I was there.
Yeah.
But then when I got on site, everybody was really nice, and they signed me in, and then started the gauntlet of interviews, which I thought I did pretty well in a few of them, especially over each room. What they did, I guess no one was there in Mountain View, so every interview was like over like a Skype, not Skype, like a Google Hangout.
Yeah, Zurich is a significantly smaller office, and everybody is located split between two campuses, one by the main train station and one over in this other area that we've occupied for a long time. All of our interviews, once you're on site, are actually on site. You'll be there talking in person to the person that's interviewing you.
And that's what's cool about a company like Google, is they have offices all over the world, really.
Yep.
And so I'm sure if you wanted to, you could transfer to a different office if they could, if that allows you to. I mean, you can't work remotely from what I've talked to, or at least not the traditional sense, like everyday remote.
10 years ago, it used to be allowed. Nowadays, they've really frowned upon it. The public number that we disclose for engineering employees has got to be in the tens of thousands, probably even high tens of thousands. I would bet less than 100 of them work full-time remote.
Yeah, I bet that's true. All right. Let me ask you a few more questions.
Sure.
So obviously you talked about algorithms being an important skill, and that I think so definitely when you start doing real computation, real work in computing and programming. Do you think that for a lot of the advice we give new people getting into like just web development, we talk about creating a portfolio, especially for people who don't have the traditional education, trying to find a way to get their name, trying to find a way that when the HR people look through their resumes, that they stop at theirs for some reason. Do you have just off the top of your head, do you have any tips for like new developers how to get how to stand out from the crowd so they can get a job? If
Yeah,
not
so
at Google, but elsewhere.
the first thing that you should do is actually know somebody who works at the company, because if you get an in-person reference, you're guaranteed to at least get a call back from the recruiter. If you just apply blindly, I think that they've released numbers on this. It's got to be, we get a large number every day of people applying online. And by large, I mean more than 10 or 20. I'm guessing the number is somewhere in the hundreds or thousands, but you obviously can't quote me on that because I don't know for sure. Knowing somebody in person who already works at the company, best way to go. Beyond that, something else that works for academics or for people who are going to something where Google has a representative there, show up at a conference. So like if there's a code jam or something going on, or if there's an academic conference that you know about, that you know that Google will have a booth set up, go there, introduce yourself, talk to the recruiter or the engineer who's there, bring a resume, drop it off. You will most likely at least get a call back from a recruiter.
So a little bit of networking, getting to know people.
Yeah, I think that is by far the easiest thing. Now, if you're talking about just how, like, what sort of project you can work on in your spare time in order to get noticed, I think it's so hard. I think just go and look at, for example, the App Store. There's millions or tens of millions of apps out there. How many of them have made it big? A couple thousand at most. The chance of you writing the next big thing that's really going to get you noticed is pretty small. And to be honest, if you do write the next big thing, you might end up making more money from that than you would from working for Google. So it's not, if your aim is to go work for a big company like Google or Facebook or Apple, it's important to have that portfolio to show people at the end, but that's not how you're going to get your name spotted in the sea of thousands or tens of thousands.
That's interesting. Would you say, I mean, you've hired a lot of people and you know the people that hire a lot of people. Do you think that having like a good portfolio, like on, like, let's say you have a personal web page or a personal website, and then at least you have some pet projects that you worked on, even though maybe you just made them up, or maybe maybe you did some freelancing, would that impress you or the people? Would that be impressive at all, or would it have to be something a lot larger, like an actual app that was deployed to the App Store or got some traction?
So if somebody submits a resume, so you have to submit a resume when you apply. And then if you make it through the recruitment process and you get to the interview process, each interviewer is given your resume and a list of all the questions that you've been asked so far. So we make sure you don't get a repeat question during your interviews. A lot of interviewers will skim the resume, but if they don't see something that immediately catches their interest because they're intimately familiar with it already, they're not even going to pay attention to it. So like I'll get a high level, like, okay, this person has a background in math. So it's probably more acceptable to ask these kinds of questions because they might actually know them. So I'm trying to give them a chance to show that what they know. There was one time when I told you I did my PhD both on parallel processing and on GPU computing. There's one time I interviewed somebody who had a really deep background in GPU computing. So when I saw that, I actually made it a point to ask the person about it. But it didn't do anything for or against my impression of them to hire. So as an interviewer, the only thing I can do is tell the hiring committee the questions I asked, tell the hiring committee the answers that the candidate gave me, and give the hiring committee my impression. Do I feel like this person would be a good fit? Do I feel like they're technically savvy, et cetera, et cetera? Knowing what they work on in their spare time doesn't really impact my opinion at all. If somebody says that they're like a major Linux kernel hacker and they have like the 10th most commits all time, that's great. But the interview process is there for people to show in person what they can do.
Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense. So it might help you. So what I'm hearing from you, deconstructing that for a second, that it might help you get into the interview because maybe the recruiter will see what you've done, or maybe they will look at your portfolio or the projects that you've worked on. But once you get inside the project, or once you get farther into the interview process, then the interviewer might use that to help them ask different questions, but it doesn't necessarily influence anything after
Yeah,
that, basically.
that is correct. The
So
fact
you,
that you are a major kernel hacker or you develop the like third most popular game ever on the App Store
mhm.
doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, that's interesting because I mean that I guess if you're looking purely at someone's technical skills, and that's not necessarily true. I know Google looks at a lot of other things too, but if you want to judge people the same way, you have to have the same sort of rubric for every single person that you're going through your interview process. That way, it's fair and balanced, and that it doesn't everyone gets a fair shot, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make sense to say, you know what, this person did pretty, like to take two candidates who did exactly the same on all on both of their phone screens and all 5 or 6 of their in-person interviews, but one person has written some killer app and the other person is just out of university. Like, why? What difference does that really make? The whole point of the interview process is to vet them. If we just cared about what you've done in the past, we wouldn't even interview you.
Yeah, I think that's true too, and a lot of other first-time jobs that new programmers are looking to try to get interviews for is just getting past that HR firewall to try to get to talk to someone and then show them that you have the skills to do the job. That's really important.
Yep, I agree.
And then just practicing those skills.
Yeah.
Is there any like soft skills that you think are important for developers? I mean, any ways they approach people? I mean, I could say for myself that I feel like I'm like more of an introverted person. And so I really have to try when I'm like interviewing or meeting people to try to get out of my comfort zone. I guess introversion is, well, the way I want to say it is that I get most of my energy when I'm by myself, and then it's a little more draining when I'm around other people. I guess that's maybe one definition of what I think about it. Is there some certain soft skills you think that people can have that can help
Well,
them with their job interview skills?
so during the interview, I think the most important thing you can do is always let the interviewer know what's going on in your head. And that's very hard for a lot of people. So especially if you're an introvert, as you said, you just tend to do better when you're alone, when you can think, when you don't have to vocalize everything. But as both somebody who has been interviewed and somebody who interviews, I can tell you right now, every step of the way, if you can tell the interviewer what you're thinking, why you're doing something, it makes it so much easier for both people.
So does that mean like when you're doing the algorithm interview on the whiteboard that you say, well, this is why I'm putting C equals 15 here, and this is why I'm doing a map here, that
Yeah.
type, or just like every question, you're just trying to kind of do a brain dump of what you're thinking at the time?
And so both actually, both are rather important. So the I would say the latter more than the former. If you're writing code, sometimes what I hope you would have done is told the interviewer, okay, you presented me with this problem. I feel like the solution that I could come up with is this, and it will run in this much run. It has this sort of complexity, which I think is good. And the interviewer will usually say, okay, yeah, that actually sounds reasonable. Why don't you try and write it? If you've already told them where you're going, usually the code kind of flows from there, and so you don't have to say like I'm going to use a vector because it's backed by an array and therefore it's efficient. That part is pretty obvious, but telling somebody how the general algorithm that you came up with works is much more important. And it's really hard for some people to vocalize that. It's incredibly difficult, much more than most people would think. A lot of people, especially coming out of university, have kind of, they've played around with some stuff and they have an idea of what works and what doesn't. And so they just have like this kind of go-to toolbox. Like, okay, for this sort of problem, I know that I can do this sort of thing. They don't even think about why that's the right thing to do. They just do it. And so it's hard for them to explain why it's what they chose.
Is it okay to ask for hints along the way if you get stuck?
Always. In fact, if you feel like you're stuck, the first thing I would encourage someone to do is stop for a moment. Just think, just say, you know what, tell the interviewer, I need to stop and think for a moment because I'm stuck. If after 5-10 seconds you're just still sitting there, by all means, tell them that you're stuck and that you're not sure where to go. So I can tell you one thing, an interviewer is never going to sit there and just let you say, I'm stuck, and just watch you for 45 minutes. It's not going to happen because that's a terrible experience for both the person being interviewed and the interviewer. If you get stuck on one bump, you know what, maybe you're going to get stuck on the next thing. And if at the end of the interview, the interviewer has just basically done the problem for you, they're going to write that down in their feedback, and you're not going to get a good score for that interview. But if you got stuck in one place and then suddenly you get past it and you just blew through the rest of the problem, they're going to say, oh yeah, he got stuck here, but we got right past it, and he or she did a fantastic job afterwards. So it probably wasn't a big deal.
So don't feel like you can never ask questions, because I think some people, when they go through the interviews, they get so nervous. They're like, and then I know when I've gone through some interviews, I've been like, oh, like I'll be hard on myself during the interview. And I know that you got to kind of stay calm and poised, and then just treat it like very professionally and say, hey, I'm kind of stuck here. Can you help me? Instead of being like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that you have to understand is interviews are like standardized tests. You can be a fantastic student and still fail tests because you're just not a good test taker. You can be the best engineer in the world, but a terrible interviewer. I think a lot of people, they see these interviews and they see it more as like, oh, this company is trying to block me from getting the job. This is an obstacle I have to overcome. And I don't really think you should look at it that way. I think any tech company out there is interested in 3 qualities from a person. Can they code? Because you're getting a programming job. Can they think? Because they're going to give you problems that nobody at the company has even thought about solving before. So it's not like you can just go run and ask somebody or look it up online. And the third thing, can you do both of those in a reasonable amount of time? It doesn't matter if you can write 10,000 lines of really elegant code that solves this problem. If it takes you 20 years, no one's going to hire you. If you just remember, those are the 3 things that they're looking for. Let me do my best to demonstrate it. I think you'll realize that keeping your poise, asking questions when you're stuck to show them, yes, I can think, but everyone hits a roadblock. Sometimes questions just have a gotcha, and you're just having a bad day or a bad moment, and you just need a little nudge in the right direction.
Yeah, that reminds me of Joel Spolsky has a famous article on how he does his hiring of looking for people that can get stuff done. I think it's very similar to what you're saying. Which I'll include in the show notes below for people who are watching. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I think people will take away a lot from this. Let me think if there's anything else I missed asking you. I think we could probably talk about this for quite a while. Is it okay if you do fail an interview? I mean, like most jobs, you can reapply, right? I mean, there's no harm in just trying again.
So there's a few things. First off, you can get, let's say you have 6 interviews. So remember, I said you have 2 phone screens and usually somewhere between 4 and 6 in-person interviews. You cannot fail both phone screens. If you do that, you're not going to get called on site. If you do really good at one and maybe you don't do so good at the other one, you might still get called on site. If you're in-person interviews, you get 4 or 5 that are really good, and the other one, somebody was doubtful. It's still very possible to get hired. And if you do make it to the interviews and you bomb them for some reason, or you barely miss out, the next calendar year, you're free to apply again.
And that's not going to hurt you anyway going back again.
No, not at all. I have personally interviewed candidates who have applied many times and been either through phone screens or on site more than once. There's I don't even think about it. I just say they're here to interview. Let me ask them one of my interview questions and see how they work with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is awesome. Any other like advice for new developers out there before we
Yeah.
wrap
So
this up?
something that I didn't know before I started working at Google, not even being an intern, but really working. Have you done any top coder competitions?
Ah,
Have
right.
you? Have you done any?
Me personally, yeah, I have not done any. No, I've
Okay.
done some elite code, but not top coder. No.
Okay, so I also have never done a top coder competition, but I know one of the big differences between top coder and the ACM programming contest that I was really into is that in top coder, you can get tons of points for looking at other people's code and finding ways to break it. There's a reason for that. At Google, the code review process is immensely important. You cannot submit anything to our code base without it getting reviewed. And it really pays to be a good code reviewer. One, because it makes sure that the code that you're working on is going to be nice and clean, because you're giving somebody else critique on what they're writing, and you're saying, oh, well, if I were to use this code, it would be very difficult because like these parts don't really fit well together, etc. But two, it's also a really good way to catch bugs. I would swear that we've caught more bugs by doing code reviews than any other means.
Nice. And when you guys do code reviews, is there it feels like the bigger the amount of code, like there's some kind of correlation to the from for some people for the amount of time they put into actually reviewing it. So if you have a 5 line code review, you know, someone they'll spend an hour like testing it and writing a huge write up on it. But if you have 25 2,500 lines, someone says it looks good. I don't know. I guess it depends on the culture, and you got to make sure that
Yeah,
people are
everybody.
like pulling it down and actually testing it.
Yeah, so Google has a really big testing culture. You actually, it's perfectly legitimate for your code reviewer to say you didn't write any unit tests for this, so no, it doesn't look good until you write unit tests to verify that everything works. Like they'll say, I'm not even going to look at the code until then. That's very common because once you start that process, everyone just learns to write unit tests, and the code immediately gets better for it. Um, the other thing that I would say is that we actually have a website. We I can talk about this more later, probably offline because it's kind of tangential. But we have what's called a readability process to make sure that the code that you write is readable by others. And we call it readability, not writability, because we want every single line of code to be able to be read by anybody. So there's lots of standards you have to maintain. Part of that is that we say that large change lists, large code reviews are bad. If you have something that's 1,000 lines or 2,500 lines, you can almost certainly break it up into smaller pieces and send each of those small pieces out to be reviewed.
I see. So on top of just writing really well maintained code with unit tests, automated tests, and with them, you're saying if you have a bug or story, I don't know, whatever you guys use, pull or bug story, pull that you're working on, and you create some sort of pull request, or
Mm-hmm.
that if it's too long, then that may have been a story that could have been split up into smaller parts,
Yeah, definitely.
and then that would have been an easier to code review for the person code reviewing it, because they wouldn't have to look through 2,500 lines.
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to spot a bug in 2,500 lines of code. You are going to spot something funny in 5 lines of code. But at the same time, maybe you do write something that's 600 lines and really can't be broken up because the functionality is really tied together. That's acceptable, but just be prepared to justify it.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. I think that's probably good advice for any organization trying to do code reviews. And do you guys use Agile over there? I'm obviously
My group does not know.
okay. So it just depends on the organization in Google, and they use different methodologies.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard some groups using Agile software development practices. We don't use that by name.
Okay.
We either have features that we're working on, a new system that we're working on, or bugs that we're fixing.
I'd like to go back 1 second. You brought up coding contests. I remember ACM. I was after you had we had gone to school together for a couple of years, and then you had graduated, and then I think I took like a year off, and I came back to school, and I was a part of the Association of Computer Machinists, ACM, and they had their own programming contest. And I think that's a great way. If you are in the university, you're a student, look up your local ACM chapter, see if they have one available at your school, or if they have a computer club, and then look at what activities they do. And usually most of them put together some kind of programming contests. And usually it's about, I don't know, you would say you get, everybody gets together like on a Sunday, and there's a set of problems, and then there's some way you can submit those problems once you fix them. And then it's usually like a quick afternoon, and then at the end of the day, you pick up winners, and you can have winners between the undergraduate and the graduate, or you can, I think we did like sophomore, under, and senior.
We had people who had taken data structures and people who had not taken data structures. That was our cutoff.
That's true. Yeah. So if you hadn't taken data structures, you were in this one group. And if you had taken data structures, you were. And it was kind of a fun way. And we usually got sponsors too. So there was money involved.
Yeah. And usually free pizza. Hey.
Yeah. And then also there was a national group, right? That
we had
these contests.
Yeah. So we had regional contests, and then all the winners and the runner-up, sometimes a set of runner-ups or runners-up from the bigger regions would get invited to the international finals, to the world finals.
Right. And I think you and I did pretty good a couple of years.
Yeah. Well, the last year I did it, we were one position away.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah, that team, I can't remember, but yeah, I remember you guys had some really, maybe Sebastian was on your team, right?
It was me, Brian Westfall, and Deanna Midell.
Yeah, really smart people. Look them up. Really smart people in ACM. I never went to I did participate in the contests locally, just our local ACM chapter, but I never went to the regionals or nationals. But that's a great way. Like, you get to meet people. You're going to work on problems you're probably even harder than you would see in a lot of interviews. And these are problems going to make you think.
Yep, definitely. If you can do well in those, if you can do well in those sorts of programming challenges, you'll probably do well in interviews.
And if you're not in the university, in a university, then you can just go to Top Coder, and they have those same type of challenges happening all the time, right?
Yep, exactly. I mean, not just Top Coder. I know Top Coder is sponsored by Google, or even maybe run by Google, but there's tons of different places where you can go to find those sorts of programming challenges. Don't limit yourself just to that one.
Yeah, or just go to like Code Fights or Leak Code, or the one thing I like about Pramp.com is that you're like on a one-on-one interview with somebody. You have a problem, you do the problem, and then they check it, and then they do the problem, you check it, and it's like an hour-long format. So that helps too.
Oh, nice.
Cool. All right, Jeff. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for coming on here. I really appreciate it. And take care.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Nice seeing you.